The history of the United States is filled with fascinating stories that shape how we as Americans live today. In Our Germans, Project Paperclip and the National Security State, historian Brian Crim explores how the aftermath of World War II significantly impacted the United States. In particular, Crim argues that integrating German scientists into the United States after World War II helped to create the modern national security state. Project Paperclip was a top secret government operation that transferred 1,500 German and Austrian scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. The catch? Many of these people were former members of the Nazi Party. Army ordnance officers in charge of selecting people for the program attached a paperclip to the folders of rocket experts they wanted to employ, hence the project's name. Participants in this operation primarily migrated to the U.S. between 1945 and 1947, with 90% of the contracted Germans becoming U.S. citizens and permanent residents. By the fall of 1945, a new world order was forming, with the United States emerging as the sole superpower in the international system. U.S. civilian and military officials began planning a post-war agenda that closely linked military and foreign policy. Military planners advocated for integrating the military, the economy, and science and technology, essentially creating national security, a new term at that time. The U.S. designed the national security state as a preparative and defensive measure to ensure the efficient mobilization of resources against an aggressor nation intent on going to war. The primary motivator was American concern over the Soviet Union's intentions as the Cold War began brewing. Project Paperclip played a pivotal role in establishing the early stages of a national security state. So what's the connection between German scientists and the formation of a national security state in the US? According to Crim, it all started in the early 20th century, when the world envied German science and technology. In June 1944, knowing Germany's scientific potential and the serious threat posed by the Allied powers, the leader and Führer of Germany, Adolf Hitler, issued a decree ordering the advancement of Germany's weapons to outmatch those of the Allies. Enter the scene Dr. Werner von Braun, the most famous German scientist eventually recruited by Project Paperclip, who invented the V-2 rocket for Germany. He saw V-2 rockets as a gateway into space travel, something he dreamed of accomplishing, and later did when he worked for NASA. Von Braun was a member of the SS and worked with a team of scientists, engineers, and military technocrats to develop and build V-2 rockets. For these reasons, von Braun was on the US government's radar and later became a vital piece of the Paperclip program. Following the war, American military leadership built a case for recruiting German scientists. Major General Hugh Neer provided the best justification, explaining that, quote, occupation of German scientific and industrial establishments has revealed the fact that we have been alarmingly backward in many fields of research. If we do not take this opportunity to seize the apparatus and the brains that developed it and put the combination back to work promptly, we will remain several years behind while we attempt to cover a field already exploited. Pride and face saving have no place in national insurance, end quote. This became the prevailing attitude among U.S. military officials involved in Project Paperclip. The project's implementation coincided with rising tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, who had been allies during World War II. The growing mistrust justified the American need for a national security state embedded within what was soon called the Military Industrial Complex, or MIC, all supported by scientific infrastructure. The MIC, which President Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address, combined military strategy with private capital to simultaneously encourage profit while creating the resources and technology of the national security state. President Harry S. Truman played a key role in laying the foundation for this infrastructure, approving Project Paperclip in July 1945 and signing the National Security Act, or NSA, into law in 1947. A massive coordinated effort between military and civilian agencies began to ship unfinished V-2 rockets from Germany, while the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, evaluated hundreds of German scientists and dependents for authorization to work in the United States. The JIOA recruited the best and brightest German minds to enhance America's growing defense establishment. Paperclippers eventually served in influential positions inside the national security state, supporting the growing military-industrial complex, which they were largely responsible for creating. You can probably imagine the controversies surrounding the decision to recruit Nazis to work for the government when previously officials spent billions of dollars in a war effort to eradicate the Nazi regime. This controversy caused a fight between two governmental departments, the JIOA and the Department of State. While State Department officials were not opposed to exploiting German scientists for their expertise, they balked at the idea of rewarding these scientists with U.S. citizenship. They not only saw it as a potential security risk, but also as being morally outrageous, given the thousands of displaced people throughout Europe who longed to emigrate to the U.S. Samuel Klaus, a State Department representative to the JIOA, was the primary opposition against Paperclip. In an internal memo titled State Department Problems, he urged the State Department to thoroughly investigate the recruited scientists as potential security risks, including implementing surveillance once they began work on Project Paperclip. Despite Klaus's concerns, the military eventually received the full support that it needed from the State Department. Moreover, the military debated when and how to reveal Project Paperclip to the public. Gallup conducted a poll in January 1947 which showed wide public disapproval of importing Nazi scientists into the U.S., with 7 Americans in support for every 10 who opposed the idea. Despite how Americans felt, the MI6 successfully incorporated the paperclippers into the U.S. As time passed, many Americans became less worried about the defeated Nazis and more worried about the growing threat of the Soviet Union, solidifying the need for Project Paperclip. Controversy over granting specialized work visas to foreigners is not a new subject. Today, the Trump administration and Republicans are fighting over how many foreigners can receive H-1B visas. These are special permits granted to foreign professionals to work in the U.S. Notable figures close to Trump, like billionaires Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, support these visas, claiming they would help Silicon Valley tech companies recruit excellent engineering talent. Critics of the visas, like Trump loyalist Steve Bannon, call the program a scam and view it as a cheap labor program for illegal immigrants. What can we learn from Project Paperclip? America, despite being a nation built by immigrants, has historically struggled with immigration policy, with heated debates still occurring today. The biggest rationale for top-secret government operations like Paperclip was the threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which similarly justified future programs like Paperclip. The JIOA concluded that preventing Soviet access to German military research was the most convincing argument for Paperclip. The Soviet Union raced against the U.S. to recruit more German scientists and technology. In April 1945, after the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, learned that U.S. forces had seized a major German V-2 rocket production site, he raged, quote, "This is absolutely intolerable. We defeated the Nazi armies. We occupied Berlin and Peenemünde," another Nazi rocket test site. But the Americans got the rocket engineers. What could be more revolting and more inexcusable? How and why was this allowed to happen? End quote. As a result of the capture of the rocket factory, Americans transferred the weaponry and around 1,300 German personnel to the western zone of Germany, which they occupied following the war. This was only the beginning of the race between the world's most powerful countries toward obtaining global military and scientific dominance. In the end, the US was more successful than the Soviets in exploiting German scientists and technology. This vicious competition between the Soviets and the US intensified the Cold War and gave the JIOA and Paperclip advocates justification for expanding the national security state. In other words, the national security state depended on German scientists as an invaluable weapon in the Cold War that could turn hot at any moment. The growing threat of Soviet dominance from late 1947 through the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik in 1957 vindicated Project Paperclip's use of German scientists. By the mid-1950s, the national security state was in full blossom, accompanied by unlimited spending and paperclippers holding influential positions and security clearances, resulting in an expanding security state. The most prominent paperclipper and rocket scientist, Dr. Wernher von Braun, now had a new team of 120 rocket scientists, engineers, and technicians who rebuilt and tested V-2 rockets in Texas and New Mexico. Von Braun served the military-industrial complex with distinction, becoming one of its chief architects and successfully incorporating science with national security as a tool against the Soviets. Von Braun later served in NASA and was one of the great minds behind the success of the Apollo moon landing. Project Paperclip became a strategically successful program that helped to create the modern national security state. Many paperclippers enjoyed U.S. citizenship and full employment in the public and private sectors, transforming many former Nazi scientists into American citizens with contributions that have continued to resonate in future generations. Today, modern American space agencies stand on the shoulders of giants like Dr. von Braun, who is the forefather of rocket technology. His contributions to American aeronautical engineering are why companies like SpaceX have rocket technology unmatched by any other country in the world. However, ethical debates still exist regarding the government's actions in creating Project Paperclip to advance its security state agenda. Do the ends justify the means? Do you think the government was justified in its efforts to bring over Nazi scientists?